Welcome back. A lot of you are in a position in these days where you find victims of human trafficking and you haven't necessarily had the training, or you heard the word a lot, but you still haven't had the training. So the human trafficking series is going to be for you. So this is part one from the survivor's perspective. And in part one, quickly, I'm going to summarize for you the 3 top myths about human trafficking. And why is it important for us to get really educated on this, especially when you work on frontlines? So number 1 myth is, it does not happen in Canada. It happens in a third world country. Number 2, kidnapping is human trafficking. Extremely misleading. And there's so many reasons why that's such a dangerous misinformation that's being spread on social media. And number 3 is that victims are all in chain and handcuffs. I was trafficked for 3 months. I never seen a handcuff or a chain. Doesn't mean that there are no victims who have not been in that position. I'm just saying that it's also extremely misleading, and we will talk about all of that in this episode. Before we dive in, it's worth to mention this pretty cool story about how much we evolved as a society in the last 15, 16, 17 years when it comes to understanding about human trafficking. So it was around 2009, maybe 2010, when I was in the streets of Hamilton and doing a research because I started my organization and we were trying to raise money and we just could not freaking raise the money for our safe house and the mobile crisis counseling. So I wanted to find out why. So I went out and I did a little research. I asked 10 people. I made up a whole thing about breast cancer that I'm raising money for the breast cancer. I even had a folder and everything. So I asked 10 people if they would give me $10 for breast cancer. And guess how many people gave me $10 for breast cancer? 10 out of 10. Guess how many asked me what breast cancer is? None. And before you start writing a arrest warrant nationwide for me for fraud under $100, you'll be pleased to know that I gave everybody their money back after the experiment. But anyways, let's get back to the story. So after the experiment, after the conversation, I actually thanked them very much for their participation. And then I had my own brochure about human trafficking and a safe house and everything else. And I went back on the streets of Hamilton and I asked 10 people again if they would give me money for human trafficking. Guess how many people, 10 out of 10, knew what human trafficking was? None. Yep. And then the questions were, isn't that happening in Thailand? Isn't that about, sorry, I don't support prostitution. And so I said, neither am I. This is for victims of human trafficking. In any case, I went back to the office and I realized that, wow, we are in a big poo-poo because, how are we going to raise money for something that people don't even know that exists? So we had a problem in Canada about human trafficking, but the bigger problem was that no one knew about it. So in a way, I guess that's when I really realized that maybe our first job is to raise awareness, but it's kind of hard because we were raising awareness and at the same time we were getting victims and each victim cost about $3,500 to $5,000, $7,000 to support while we were trying to raise money, but the people still didn't know what human trafficking was. Anyways, that's in the past and we have came a long way. There's a ton of organizations now. There's funding. People kind of know what human trafficking is, or at the very least, people know the word human trafficking. So if I were to go out on the street now and I ask people, have they heard about human trafficking? I can guarantee you 10 out of 10 is going to say yes. Now, the problem is that if I ask them if they know exactly what human trafficking is, people are going to start telling me, it's like kidnapping, it's like this, it's like that. Now, again, I'm not complaining, guys, because we came a long way in 17, 15, however many years. And now we are here to get to the next stages where we're going to correct all those myths. And then the next stage is when we're actually going to start working about the problem. And the next stage is when we're actually going to trying to, at the very least, prevent it. So I think there's so many different layers to this. I'm glad that you're here. The fact that you're listening to this episode, that means that you are either working around human trafficking, you're a parent, concerned citizen, At any rate, you want to know what human trafficking is, and I'm going to do my very best to kind of break down those top 3 myths for you in this specific episode. Like I said, there will be more episodes added, so just keep an eye out for those. Number 1 myth: it happens only in third world countries. Completely untrue. Clearly, my story kind of is a proof that that's absolutely not true. So in Canada, when I was a victim in 1998, there was hundreds and thousands of Eastern European girls that were basically imported into Canada, right into the sex industry. And so it was interesting because I was in a parliament in 2010 when we first started talking about it. And I was sitting in the House of Commons where I was listening to an MP member talking about the fact that there's no human trafficking in Canada. There's no victims in Canada. And I don't understand why we need to talk about this, let alone why we need the legislation. So it was interesting for me to sit there and listen. And what was also really cool is that another MP member got up and said, please, my dear coworker, look up in the gallery and take a look at that young woman who's listening to you talking. She's actually a survivor of human trafficking. You can imagine that there was a little silence in the room for a moment. But in any case, no, human trafficking does not only happen outside of or in third world countries. It happens right here in Canada. It happens in big cities. It happens in small cities. I always say this: if you have highways, if you have internet, if you have young teenagers, if you have industries where they need labor, you most likely going to have some type of form of exploitation or human trafficking. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of what type of human trafficking, how many victims, so on and so forth. Also, you might not have victims in your very own town where there's maybe 10 people live, but if your town is near a highway, people are going to travel right through your highway. When I used to speak to public audience, and at this rate, I would look around in the room and everybody looked pale, almost fainting. And then I had to realize, oh my gosh, I just basically told them that no matter where they go, there will be human trafficking. And honestly, that's not the point of this conversation. And I used to tell them, and I used to start the presentations to say, look, we can get all scared or turn our back on this issue and walk away because we don't want to hear it, put our head in the sand, or you can just listen to it, and get knowledge, because knowledge is power, and just keep your eye open. Just because you close your eyes and walk away doesn't mean that crime is not going to happen. So it's most definitely not about making you scared or terrified and, oh, here we go, another thing I need to worry about. No, it's another thing you should just know about. And if you know the real signs and not the myth, you actually have a chance to either prevent it or help someone, help a friend, daughter's friend. That's what this is all about. So myth number 1, it only happens outside of Canada and third world countries. No, we crashed that. It happens in Canada. It can happen in big cities, small cities. It can happen into towns. Like I said, if you have highways, internet, teenagers, or areas where people need labor, most likely you have some type of form of exploitation or human trafficking. Myth number 2. So when I took some time off from speaking on human trafficking, I was on social media, God knows why, but I saw these videos from these moms in their car and putting out public service announcement and saying, this could happen to your kid. There was a human trafficking case in a parking lot of IKEA. And I was like, I love IKEA. No way, come on. So I actually listened to the story. It was kidnapping. Had nothing to do with human trafficking. So she goes on and describes how a young woman went to her car and there was a van pulled up and this young woman was pushed into the van and kidnapped. That's kidnapping. So I started to pull my hair out one by one because I actually started reading the comments too. And I go, yeah, thank you so much for your, awareness. Thank you so much for teaching us. No, I'm like, no. No, kidnapping and human trafficking, they are not the same. So let's talk about why they are not the same. I can tell you what human trafficking is. I've never been kidnapped, thank God, but let's talk about what human trafficking is and why it's not kidnapping. In most cases, the individuals actually get lured into the situation. When I say in most cases, There's a large amount of cases where they get lured in. There's a small percentage of human trafficking cases, in particularly sex trafficking cases, and we'll talk about that in another episode, where there is a trafficker type called gorilla pimp. And yes, occasionally they would go to nightclubs, bus stations, wherever they can find young ladies. Occasionally they would basically invite the girl in a car and take off. And yeah, that is kidnapping. However, something like what the woman described in a video, a young lady goes to the parking lot and gets snitched by a trafficker in a van. That's not how it works. So human traffickers spend a little time with their potential victims and they lure them into the situation. And once the victim is away from their family, loved ones, safety, school, whatever, that's when they're going to start this engagement on, okay, you got to do this work for me, or you got to do that, or whatever. But there's always a little bit of a prep work involved in human trafficking. So human traffickers take time to get to know their victims and lure them into the situation and lure them away from their current location or whatever. So very, very unlikely that a van would pull up. And the reason for why that is so super dangerous to think that that's human trafficking is because say you see somebody is getting kidnapped, and it is actually kidnapping, and you call the police and you say, hey, I saw someone being human trafficked instead of kidnapped. And so what's going to happen is that the dispatch is going to get the human trafficking unit on the phone. And sometimes they're not in the office because they're out investigating. So you're going to leave a message. Now you're just wasting precious time from the police potentially finding that kidnapped victim that was actually kidnapped. So when you see somebody being snatched from the streets and being put in a van that is kidnapping, call the police and say someone was kidnapped and let the police decide if it's kidnapping or actually is a part of some kind of a human trafficking. But please don't report human trafficking unless you're absolutely 100% sure and you know the signs. And we'll talk more about this in other episodes. But for now, I really just wanted to crush the crap out of this freaking myth number 3. Victims of human trafficking are chained and handcuffed. So like I said, I was trafficked for 3 months. I've never been handcuffed and I've never been chained. And there is a reason for it. And it actually goes back to the point about kidnapping. So human traffickers have to spend time to get to know their victims, depending on what kind of a trafficking, again, if it's sex trafficking or forced labor. But in both cases, what happens is there's a prep work happens. And during the prep work, that's when they do the brainwashing. That's when they sell a story, a life, a dream, hopes. And that's how they lure the victims away from their current situation. Every single victim has one thing in common. They are desperate for something. Is it money? Is it money for their mother's medication? Is it a better life, a job, an iPhone? Just love or attention. Whatever that is, the trafficker who lures them, because they do the prep work, they realize what that is. So that is the brainwashing piece. That's the prep work where they actually sell them that dream. They make that victim believe that if they get on this job or go with them or whatever, they're going to get their dream. We call that the carrot. So in my case, and this is why we call it invisible chains, because in my case, they promised me a better life. They promised me a really good job that would end up paying for all of my debt back in Hungary so we wouldn't lose our home. But so when I came to Canada, it was very clear within a few hours that the job that they promised is not exactly what I thought I'm going to be doing. And also, I'm already here. I owe them a lot of money. I have nowhere to go. I have no one to call. I can't really, ask for help. I don't even know what I'm involved in at this point. All I know is that this was our last chance for me to find money so that we can save our home, and I need to make this work. I was desperate. I was in a tunnel vision. So here I am in Canada, and they tell me, that I have to go to work, and it's not the exact work that we agreed upon when I came here. And that if I don't hand over my money, they are going to hurt my family. If I leave the motel, they're going to hurt my family. If I leave the strip club, they're going to hurt my family. Or they're going to send messages to the TV station where I used to work at and tell them that I'm now a prostitute on drugs, which would be awful because now they're going to destroy everything that I have back home and I will have nothing to go back to. And that was exactly their goal. And they told me this for 2 weeks. They brainwash you. They tell you all the things that they're going to do to you if you don't do what they tell you to do. Or they tell you what's going to happen if you leave, which is why we don't leave, which is actually another big question mark for the public. Why don't they just leave? Or it doesn't have to be that nasty. They just say, hey, I'm not going to sponsor your work permit. You have to work for me for 2 months for free, and then I'm going to sponsor your work permit. And then, you can make all the money you want, except that 2 months becomes 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, a year. And by then you're too deep in. You don't speak English. You have no money. They have your passport. You have nowhere to go. So again, they don't need to chain you. First of all, if they chain you, people could see that you're in chains. What would happen if, you take a van full of people to the bank to pick up their checks and they're all in chains? Of course, somebody would call the police. So no, there's no chains involved for the most cases, like I said. And that brings me to my bonus point, which is why don't we leave, which is what I just explained. We have what's called the invisible chain. And the invisible chain is everything that they brainwashed with what's going to happen if we leave. And honestly, just think about this, guys. Say you work for something for 6 months and you give it all you got. And then they say, oh, you just got to do 1 more month and then it's all yours. Wouldn't you just keep on going? You have nowhere to go, nowhere to be. You don't even know how to get out of here. You don't have money. You don't speak the language. Or even if you speak the language, no one's going to understand what just happened to you. You feel like an idiot. You feel ashamed. You feel like that no one's going to actually understand what you got involved in. In a lot of cases, people don't leave because they're still hoping that whatever that carrot was, they can still get it. They can still get their money, or they can still get that house. They can still get whatever the reason why they got involved at the first place. So we don't leave for a million reasons. Number 1 is we are afraid. Number 2, because we have a trauma bond. Number 3, because we still have that hope to get that carrot. We actually have an amazing advanced course on our TC Online Institute site on the mindset of a victim of human trafficking. We've been doing that for 4 or 5 years online. It's been distributed to police officers all across Canada. You can find it on CPKN. And if you're not in Canada and if you want access to it, just email us on TC Online Institute. If you're a service provider, we have a course called Can You See Me Now? Again, it's also on TC Online Institute. It's a detailed course. We go in a lot more details. Like I said, if you're a frontline worker, this might be helpful for you. So, but please do me a favor. Now that you listen to this, help me spread the message. You don't have to promote my episode here, but if you want to, that would be great. But if you want to just tell your friends, family, and anybody that's on your social media the 3 top myths about human trafficking and debunk them, that would be incredible. So number 1, human trafficking is not just happening in third world countries. So if you live in Australia or UK, please tell your friends and family, human trafficking happens right here. Now, if you're living in Canada, you can even say 90% of the victims that have been documented in reports since, 2010-ish are Canadian victims, Canadian girls, anywhere between the age of 10, 11 to 25. And that's actually a fact. You can go ahead and research it. There's a million stats online. And then you can say myth number 2, kidnapping is not human trafficking. Please know the signs. That would help huge. Number 3, not every victim of human trafficking wears chains. So please stop using those images for your posters and awareness campaigns. Extremely misleading. And that's because, and you can explain that, because people looking for victims of human trafficking in chains, while you could stand in Starbucks and stand right behind two victims of human trafficking who's clearly giving the signs, but you're not reading them because you're looking for chains. So thank you so much for helping me out with this. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this was helpful. Like I said, we'll have more episodes on human trafficking and we're going to unpack all of it. But for now, let's just start with destroying those naughty myths that come out of nowhere from people who are not necessarily familiar with this topic. So thank you for helping me educating everybody else. And let's connect on the next episode.